Hi everyone, this is Shri, and in this video, you'll learn about how to answer estimation questions. If you haven't already, please check out my PM interview series, which is going to be popping up somewhere over here as a link, which will give you a high-level overview of all of the upcoming articles that will be posted here on after. With that, let's get started. In today's session, we'll cover these topics. What is an estimation question? What are some useful frameworks in the context of product management interviews? What are some estimation types, deep dive examples, and ending this session with some useful tips. So, what is an estimation problem? It is a Fermi problem which involves a quick back of envelope calculation and does not involve any advanced mathematics like calculus. It is very good to make quick guesstimates, which are close approximations of the actual numbers. These are typically of the form: how big is the pet industry, how much energy spent on street lights, and you could come up with very close approximations using very simple arithmetic. Right? So, what are some of the frameworks you could use to answer these types of questions? So, as soon as you get a question, for example, how big is the pet industry, you clarify. And within clarify, you try to understand the question and underline anything that is ambiguous, any nouns, like what does a pet industry mean, right? And then you go through constraints, and I'd love to use this time, location, segment methodology, which is TLS. So time is, what is a time period? Like, let's say if it's market size, is it annual? Is it monthly? Location, US, worldwide, segment, consumer, business, and assume and state your assumptions clearly to the interviewer, right? Second is you clearly mention your approach that you're going to take. And what the interviewer is looking for is a high-level mathematical formula. Then you need to break it down into components, plug in some numbers, calculate, and come up with the answer. And you're not done until the last step, which is validation, which is you are sanity checking that final number you came up with and confirming it by going back and revisiting all the math and all the equations that you have, and then giving your final answer to the interviewer. Right? So now let's look at some estimation types broadly. Even though there's a lot of estimation types, I see it mainly being divided into two types based on the interview questions that are being asked. One is sizing, and the second one is volumes. Let me explain what I mean by each of these. So sizing usually take the form of what is the market size of cars, or annual revenue of cars, or market size of shampoo industry, right? It could even be storage cost of Google Photos, for example, right? And the general guideline or approach here is number of units times price per unit. So A times B. Here, as an example, for annual revenue of cars, A would be number of US households that buy a car in a year times B, which is average car price. Again, I'm just keeping it very high level. Later on, I'll take a detailed example and deep dive into it. Right? Again, same thing. Let's say this question was storage cost of Google Photos, for example. Then what you do is you take the storage usage in GB per person times number of users times average cost per GB of storage. Right? Again, you break it down to the same thing. That's a sizing question. Second type that we discussed was volume. And so this takes of the form number of X in Y. So here, number of restaurants in a city. And the general guideline here is demand supply, right? So it's demand units, which is A, divided by supply units, which is B, will give you the volume X. And an approach here as an example for number of restaurants is the base unit here is number of meals. And A would be number of meals consumed at restaurants in a day. B is number of meals one restaurant can serve in a day, and that'll give you the total number of restaurants needed to match capacity. The other way you could answer it is also taking the area of the city and seeing how many restaurants could fit within that area. But that's another way of answering as well. but here I'm showing the demand supply way of answering these volume-based questions. So now let's deep dive into some examples in each question type. So first, size. So let's say the question was market size of refrigeration industry. So first, clarify. What does market size here mean? And you clarify it as revenue. Okay, good. It's not the number of people. What does refrigeration mean? Okay, it's fridges. Got it. Then you go to time, location, and segment. So here you know that it's market size and it's annual revenue. Location is just the US, segment is the home fridges. Now that you have all your clarifying questions answered, move on to approach. In the approach here, as we learned earlier in the slide, is number of units times price per unit. And breaking that down for this specific refrigeration market size question, you have number of households that buy fridges in a year times average price per fridge, which is B. Now, so this is your high-level mathematical formula. Then you break it down into components. So you take A from this equation, and then you see that it's US households times percentage of people that can have fridges times replacement rate, which is how many times people replace their fridges in a year. And then B is going to be number of fridges per household times average fridge price, right? So now let's go into actually plugging in some numbers into these equations. So what are some of the numbers you would need is US households, which is 100 million, assuming 300 million US population, and then 3 people per household. Percentage with fridges, I'm thinking maybe 90%, even though most people will have fridges. There might be some cases where people are living in places where there's common fridges like hostels. So I'm good with 90% there. And then replacement rate, what I have seen is typically people replace a fridge in 10 years. So that's 10% in a year replacement rate, right? So now plugging into our mathematical equation there, you have 100 million times 90% times 10%, that gives us 9 million. And here we're ignoring growth. That is, there's new households being built all the time, and you clarify that with your interviewer, right? Second is B, which is number of fridges times average fridge price. I think some houses have 2, but I'm going to go, the average is going to be about 1 times average fridge price is like $500 is what I'm assuming here. Again, I've never bought a fridge, but that's what I'm assuming. Again, this is not to know how good you are with exactly knowing the number, but what is your approach? Right. With that, you come up to A times B, which is going to be 4.5 billion, which is the market size. This is annual revenue. So now you go to validate step. So you could sanity check it in 2 different ways here. So one is you could kind of see that LG, Whirlpool, all of these combined companies should be somewhere in the single-digit billions as a market size. Second is you could also divide the revenue by US population, around 300 million. You take about, like, you get about $15 per person. And so that might seem right. But if you feel that seems too high, you can always go back and double check some of the numbers. But I think it is somewhere in the single-digit billion-dollar market for the overall annual revenue of fridges, right? And then you conclude and you give your final answer to your interviewer, right? And sanity check also shows that you're very good with cross-checking and you're humble about what answer you're coming up with. You're questioning yourself in a reasonably mathematical way. Now, moving on to the volume question as an example again. Let's say the question is number of kayaks needed for a startup in Seattle. So, and as you can see, this is number of X, and you can use demand supply here. So again, clarify, what does kayaks mean here? Okay, let's say that's a single-seater small boats, right? And startup, what does startup here mean? What do they do? This is a kayak rental in one location in Seattle. Okay, great. So now, again, you go through your TLS, which is time, location, and segment. Let's say we clarify that it's annual. Seattle, when I say annual here, let's say it's how many you would get for a year for your startup. And then its location is Seattle, as mentioned in the question. Segment, let's say it's consumer. And now you have all of the clarifying questions answered. Then you move on. Again, approach here is demand by supply. What is a base unit? It's going to be number of trips. So here, A is your number of trips in a day divided by number of trips per kayak per day. Now, The next step, once you have the mathematical formula, is breaking that down into components. So A here would be Seattle population times percentage people who would be able to afford as well as interested in kayaking times market share, because there will be other competition, times your average kayak trips per day per person, right? And then you take B, which is the number of hours you're planning to keep your kayak rental open, times average duration per kayak, right? And that'll give you the total number of kayaks you would need. Now, once you have that, let's plug in some numbers. So Seattle population is around 600K, I think. Percentage of kayakers here, I think excluding about 20%, including some of the really early kids, even though there might be some who are in the teens, but again, 80% of the market times 50% of people, I'm assuming, are not interested or interested in kayaking, and 50% have the time and affordance. So that comes down to about 20% of Seattle population. Then market share, I'm thinking 5% penetration rate, because there's a lot of competition in this space. Even though you're coming up with something cool, maybe some cool cause or kayak, still 5% in a year is still aggressive, but I'm going to go with 5% here. And then average trips. So I'm thinking on average, people may be going to 2 kayak trips per year. So that'll be like 2 divided by 300. Again, even though there's 365 days a year, I'm approximating and dividing it by 300 per day, right? So that's 2 trips a year divided by 300 per day. Now, again, in interest of time, I'm doing like really quick math here, but in actual interview, you could actually break it down into several other user segments, like kayak enthusiasts versus with families, and you could average all of those separately, and then you could come up with number of trips on average. But here, in interest of time, I'm just doing some quick math and quick assumptions. So now, plugging in those numbers, you have 600K times 20% times 5% times 2 divided by 300. That'll give you 40. And again, we're ignoring growth that might happen as you progress throughout the year. It can be different. So that's 40. Then you have B. I'm assuming I'm going to be open for 10 hours, let's say. And each kayak trip, I'm going to have gone for 1 hour, right? So that means I could do 10 trips with 1 kayak. So that gives us A divided by B, which is 40 divided by 10. So that's 4 kayaks. And I'm throwing in 1 extra in case of damage to 1 kayak, so on and so forth. So that's 5 kayaks. Now you need to validate it. So you can validate it 2 different ways and sanity check it, right? One is, what is the cost for this startup going to be just for the kayaks, right? So let's say you get 5, maybe it's $1,000 per kayak, and it's $5,000. Okay, that seems a reasonable investment. And then annual revenue for startup, let's say I charge $25 for this 1 hour trip, times 40 trips per day, as you've already seen, times 300 days a year. So I'm getting about 300K. So that seems a reasonable revenue for a startup. So with that, I would confirm my final answer and go with 5 kayaks, right? Again, it's not the actual answer, but how you're approaching the problem, that's what is important. With that, let's go through some tips that will be useful during the interview. So first is always clarify anything that is ambiguous, underline any nouns, and clarify and state your assumptions with the interviewer. Have more than one solution if possible, like bottom up and top down, 2 different methods. And this will also be useful. You can use one for sanity check and one for actually solving the problem, right? In an example of the restaurant or the number of restaurants in a city question, you could use the demand supply as one solution. The other solution could be the area of the city and then figuring out how many restaurants could fit in that area. Round your numbers. Keep units like hours, trips, or dollars, so on. Use symbols in your mathematical formula, A times B times C. It'll be very easy to follow along with the interviewer. And in my experience, I've always found that expanding the billions and millions is very useful because you can quickly look at the number of zeros and make sure your final answer also has a similar magnitude so you don't make a mistake of order of magnitude. And always double check your answer, your math, before giving it back to the interviewer. and don't forget to sanity check. Right? So those are some of the tips that could be useful in your interview. With that, we've come to the end of this session. So I hope this was valuable and helpful for you. In our next session, we're going to talk about execution or analytical, and we're going to dive deep into success metrics questions of the form measure success of Facebook kind of questions. So stay tuned, and I will see you later. Bye for now.